me go ahead and get started. It's 7:05. What I'm going to do is I am going to mute everyone once we get started. And then we will, for the Zoom, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and do a 10-minute meditation. Once we finish the 10-minute meditation, I'll give the Dharma talk. And then what will be different is that after the Dharma talk, then instead of having a second meditation, we will have a discussion. And that way we can all sort of have that interaction. And so I'm going to aim to keep my Dharma talk shorter so that we can save more time for discussion. Now, the individual here who has the name as M.A. Lisa FSW, can you either unmute yourself or in the chat, let me know if you've been with us before. I need to go through all the basic instructions, or if
Hi, I've been on the I've seen you on the live, but I've never been to the actual class.
Good. But you have meditated with us before then, so you know the you know the routine. All right, good.
Yes, sir.
All right, fantastic. So let's go ahead and begin then. I'll mute everyone now. Good. So briefly, for the meditation, as always, we're going to focus on the breath. I will go through the instructions a little quicker, but I still want to go through it because it's kind of like our ritual. It starts preparing our mind for what we're about to do. So as I have mentioned before, what the primary focus of our meditation is our breath. I'm going to take my glasses off here. I have some eye issues going on, and so it's easier for me without the glasses. For the meditation, we focus on the breath being something we carry with us at all times. And so it's easier to then engage in mindfulness meditation when we anchor our practice, at least at the beginning, to our breath. If you continue to practice mindfulness meditation and the breathing exercises, what I have found and what many meditators have found is that the meditation doesn't really seem to end. If you have a regular practice, what happens is that the sensation of meditation, the mindfulness, becomes more continuous. Now, if you only practice once a week, it's hard to get into that mode of continuous meditation or continuous mindfulness. But having a regular practice, even if it's just a short few minutes, can really help prolong the pleasant state and the mindful state of meditation. The three ways we focus on the breath then here is either focusing on the sensation of the breath and how it feels, the actual mechanics of breathing, or we focus on counting the breaths. We count up to 10 and then start over again with 1. And then the third method is to use a chant, a mantra, or a gatha, a phrase or a word that's repeated over and over again. And the one that we usually recommend here is, as you're inhaling, you say breathing in your mind, you say breathing in, I calm my mind, breathing out, I smile. And you do a sort of a half smile as you breathe out, as you exhale. Given the potential for more intense emotions over the last few weeks and months, it can be very difficult to settle the mind. And so don't be hard on yourself. Don't be judgmental. If your mind has a hard time settling down because the emotions are a little bit higher than normal, then remind yourself that the goal of mindfulness meditation is not the relaxation. The relaxation is a beautiful, wonderful side effect. The goal of mindfulness meditation is to be able to observe your thoughts and your feelings without judgment. And so if you're feeling anxious, be with your anxiety. If you're feeling depressed or down or low energy, Be with your depression and your low energy. Sit with it, watch it, observe it, be curious about it. Meditation, at least mindfulness meditation, is about being able to do that as well. And that is a good practice so that you are able then to focus the tool of mindfulness in many different situations. So feeling intense emotions or anxiety does not prevent you from mindfulness meditation. It's a time, an opportunity to practice. So go ahead and get in a comfortable position. You want a position that's comfortable enough that you won't be distracted by discomfort, but not so comfortable that you fall asleep. Let me type here real quick. We're on Zoom. So for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, if you go to an earlier post on the Buddhism 101 group, you will see that I posted a link and I will let you in when you get into the Zoom meeting. So use that link to get in and I'll let you in here. So go ahead and get in a position, a comfortable position, and take a few deep breaths. It's been a while, but one of the things I like to remind people is that if you want to calm yourself, if you want to relax, make sure that your exhalation is longer than your inhalation. So you want to make sure that when you breathe out, it takes longer than when you breathe in. Good. Let's begin. Good. um, Last night I was reading some web pages on nirvana and Buddhist love. And some of the stuff that was said on those pages, along with what I've been witnessing in the news and activities I've participated in related to recent events, got me thinking. And I wanted to share with you some of the thoughts that I've had. I do want to start off by saying that like in the same way I am not a enlightened Buddha who knows everything about Buddhism, I am also not a scholar of racism who knows everything about racism. And so the goal here is to present information that might help you see things from a different perspective, to think about things in a different way, and just consider it. I'm not here to convince you either way, but just something to consider. One of the things that was mentioned that in the readings I was looking at last night was the idea that one translation of the word nirvana, and for those of you who don't know, nirvana is often described as the Buddhist heaven, but it's not a place the way heaven is a place. So it's almost like a state, a way of being. It's hard to describe, and it's even harder to describe when you don't know what nirvana is. But one translation of the word nirvana is the unconditioned. And so one way to get started learning more about what nirvana means is to maybe look at its opposite, the conditioned. And that says that there's a lot that the Buddha says about the conditioned, specifically the phrase, the conditioned arising. The idea being that there are certain conditions that when they exist gives rise to you, to me, to the self. Now, Buddhism talks about 12 links, 12 conditions, and I'm not going to go into those 12 today because I want to focus more on the fact of something being conditioned. The idea here is that there are multiple causes or chains of cause and effect that begin to overlap or cross each other. And the nexus or the node that appears when all of those lines from all these different directions interact, that's you. That's how you arise. That's the self. It is conditioned upon all these other chains of cause and effect coming together at a certain point in time and space. And from those, that interaction of all those bazillion in causes and effects, you arise. And the interesting thing is that we're seeing something similar in neuroanatomy. When we look at the brain images, when we study the brain, we have yet to find a location for the self. But what we are finding is multiple locations working at different times and in different ways. And from those interactions, the sense of self arises. And to give you an idea of what it feels like when it unarises, when it declines, that's what happens to you when you fall asleep. Where do you go? For several hours every night, your self disappears. Or at least you are not aware of the self. And it may pop up briefly during dreams. There's some slight awareness of yourself during a dream, but for the most part, the self unarises, disappears, and doesn't arise again until you are awakened. When the different parts of your brain start activating and start interacting again, and from those complex interactions, the sense of self arises. That can be a little tough to hear. But that's what the Buddha teaches. That this delusion we have that we are real, that we are independent, that we are unique, and unique in the sense of we are separate from everything else, is a delusion. It's false. You are an arising. You are a condition of many, many chains of cause and effect that came together in this point in time and space. And you arose from those interactions. Yourself arises from those interactions. And those causes and effects, those chains are the conditions that were necessary for you to be the way you are now. And these conditions, the vast majority of them, we are unaware of. So let me give you some examples of conditions that make us, or are part of our definition of self, that we are sometimes unaware of. Let's take, for example, language. So we're aware that we are speaking English. But most of us are unaware of how or what conditions led to the point where we are able to speak English to each other, or even to be able to understand and speak English ourselves. A lot of this started before we could even start forming memories. When we were even, before we were born, we are seeing that the fetus is already picking up patterns in language and can distinguish shortly after birth differences between different languages. So they played an audio tape of Russian, French, and English, and they would play each language until the child would get bored of the audio and start looking elsewhere. But the moment a different language was played, the child became interested again in the audio. So even before we are born, we are already starting to form this thing we call language. And we're unaware of it and unconscious of it. And it was the conditions that we were raised in that caused us to speak English and not Russian at this moment, or German at this moment, or Japanese, depending on who might have won the Second World War. So the different conditions that existed during our development as a fetus and eventually as a child led us to the point where we are all speaking in understanding English to each other. And some of us may have had other conditions that allowed us to speak other languages, Spanish, a little bit of French or Italian or whatever. So those are the conditions that influenced you, that are part of your definition of yourself, that you are unaware of, or at least vaguely aware of that you do it, but you're unaware of how it came to be. Another example might be gender identity. So gender and sex are very much defined by genetics, but there's also a nurture or cultural component to it. So let me give you this example. It wasn't until the 1970s that the colors blue was associated with boys and pink associated with girls. Before then, blue and pink were not assigned to any specific gender. Boys, when they were little, also wore dresses. And you'll see many pictures of boys from the early 20th century wearing dresses. But something happened along the way that dresses started being associated only with females, or primarily with females, and that the colors blue and pink were associated with specific genders. And yet for many of us who were born after the 1970s or during the 1970s have known nothing but a world where blue is associated with boys and pink is associated with girls. That's a condition. And when you ask someone randomly on the street which color goes with boys and which color goes with girls, the vast majority of the time they'll say blue and pink. We've been conditioned that way, and we were unaware that that conditioning occurred. It was just something that we do, something that we think automatically, because we were conditioned by our environment to incorporate that. The same mechanism applies to racism. You may have heard the term implicit racism or covert racism or systemic racism. Part of what goes on there is the conditions in which are present from the moment of our birth and on, that many of us are unaware of, don't realize that it's there, incorporate into our identity of self, our definition of self, incorporate into our way of thinking without even knowing the implications of that, or sometimes even the history of that. So let me give you some examples of that. One of the most profound ways in which we are indoctrinated or conditioned with to incorporate racist ideas or racist impulses is through school and through our education. Think about your history classes. The majority of the leaders that were talked about in class, and the older you are, the more obvious this was, the majority of the leaders were white males. Very rarely did I hear about anything other than white males as historical figures. And when we heard about African Americans, we may have heard about Harriet Tubman, or we may have heard of Frederick Douglass, but that's about it. Maybe Carver. And while we have many, many names of historical white males that we could name and go on for minutes and minutes. And so the underlying messaging there that we get as children is that when we are asked, What does a leader look like? If you ask a child just a vague question, what does the leader look like? And keep asking them to describe the leader, more often than not, what they end up describing is a white male, because that's what was in their education. That's what was conditioned. We don't hear about someone like Matthew Alexander Henson. Instead, we hear about someone else who was with him. Last name is Perry, I think Robert Perry. Robert Perry is said to be, or for the longest time was said to be, the first person to reach the geographical North Pole. But we have a lot of evidence that the first person was actually a person of color, an African American named Matthew Alexander Henson. He went on to be a clerk, while Robert Perry was celebrated and given many rewards for being the first one to reach the North Pole. And that's part of our education. We didn't know any better. Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman is an African-American, or biracial, African-American, Native American female who was a pilot, the first African-American, first Native American pilot, female pilot. She got her license, pilot license in France 2 years before Amelia Earhart. And yet the person that we most know and study about is Amelia Earhart. When you think of female aviators, the person we think about is Amelia Earhart. These are examples of how our conditions, when we are raised in a particular family, a particular neighborhood, a particular city, or a particular state, or a particular nation, these things are inherent in our environment. And because we've known nothing else except for that environment, it's hard to question or hard to realize when it's present. We're like fish in the ocean, not aware of the fact that there is air above the water. And so when we're so deeply immersed into these conditions, we suffer. And that's what Buddha was telling us. That's what Buddha is trying to grab our attention for. We don't learn mindfulness just so we can relax. We don't learn mindfulness just so we can calm our anxiety and depression. Those are useful ways of using mindfulness. But the ultimate goal of mindfulness, if you truly want to end suffering, is to start becoming aware of those subtle conditions. To start being aware of your reflexive emotions to certain events. That's conditioning. When you felt anger or sadness or anxiety or frustration during these last few weeks, those were conditions. They were triggered. Those emotions very often are reflexive reactions to external events. And it's in the space between perceiving the events and having the emotional reaction to the events, that short space in between, that's where mindfulness needs to intercede. That's where enlightenment starts to be found. That's where you start experiencing nirvana. When you become aware of this little gap between the external events, or sometimes internal events, and the emotional reaction, the seeking of pleasure or avoiding displeasure. And that's really the first step. That's where the mindfulness kicks in. After that, then it's about trying to recondition or uncondition what's going on. But you can't get there if you're unable to do that first step of mindfulness, of being able to be aware of that gap between the external and internal events that cause a reflexive emotional reaction. We can't be aware of ways that we may be racist if we're not aware of our reflexive emotional reactions to these external events. And if we don't reach that mindfulness first, it becomes very difficult to address the suffering that's going on right now. And it leads to despair. It leads to hopelessness, anger, and frustration. But as you become aware of it and practice becoming aware of that gap, clarity, wisdom start to seep in, start to arise, and makes it easier for us to know what is the next step, what to do next. I'll stop it there. There's definitely a lot more that we could talk about, but I would rather open it up and just have a discussion. So I'll unmute everyone. And it's going to ask you if you want to unmute and just say yes, if you're ready to talk. And then go ahead and we'll just open it up.
So I kind of want to try to tie that back to our last conversation, or well, the last talk where you were talking about, maybe it was 2 ago. Anyways, so you were talking about how...
I see you talking, but it's not, I'm not hearing you.
Hello? Talking?
I can hear you.
Can y'all hear each other?
Hello?
I can't hear
Yes,
anyone
we can.
talking.
Yeah, we can all hear each other.
Oh, that's
I can
weird.
hear.
Oh, I know what it is.
You don't have your headphones on.
No, I mute on this that the sound would my email. I'm so sorry. All right.
You're conditioned. You're
I'm
conditioned.
conditioned. All right, go ahead.
So I was trying to say one of the last talks that we had, you were talking about how people's political views can be so ingrained that when you try to discuss it with them, they block it out, emotionally. So is it kind of just the same? I mean, is it just kind of the same wavelength of trying to end suffering if you're trying to get to somebody's unconsciousness? I mean, is there any difference between kind of this talk and that talk when it comes to progressing? Probably.
So the main difference is from last week's conversation, what happens is that when the amygdala, the emotion part of our brain, becomes highly activated, especially with a negative emotion, we enter this fight or flight mode. And so changing your thoughts is tantamount to allowing your psychological self to be killed. And so that's why we passionately defend our opinions when we are very angry or very upset. Mindfulness, on the other hand, creates a bit of separation from the emotions, doesn't allow the amygdala to be highly activated, and gives you then that opportunity to be able to observe your beliefs, your emotions, your thoughts, and hopefully learn something from that observation so that then you can intervene. So today's talk was more self-focused. Last week's talk was more about what happens when there's the interaction of different selves.
Mm-hmm. So yes, I guess you can only solve your own problem, or unless other people have that openness to realize this mindfulness, right? I guess that's... Yeah.
Hearing you say that triggered something in my mind. If you want to, something else I was studying, if you want, oh, sorry, I mean, just a fresh, raw idea. One of the reasons why people defend their opinions so much is because they want to be true to their tribe, to their group. And we have tons of studies showing that people will change their views even when they know they're wrong in order to be in line with their tribe, with their group. And so the other theory here is that if you change your mind, you're alone. and no one wants to be alone. We're social creatures. When you do the opposite, when you can connect to someone, when it stops being oneself and oneself, and there is a unity there, a relationship, a bond, there is an opportunity there for change. The amygdala is less likely to be active because you're with one of your own. You're with a friend, or we're someplace safe. Think about all these, I have friends, African-American friends who have created messenger threads with their white friends so that they have a safe place to talk about and ask questions about race. What they have done is they've created a tribe, a messenger tribe, where you're all together and it's a safe place to discuss some very hard topics. And because it's a safe place, I have witnessed people more easily change their minds and their perspective. At the very least, challenge their own perspective a lot more. Something about moving away from this self as an individual and being mindful of your interconnectedness, which is also a very Buddhist thing, that cultivates an environment that's more open to change.
Very interesting.
Also, when you were talking about it's kind of changing the subject, but when you were talking about like the meditation and like it helps you realize that space between the action and your emotions, it reminds me of I once talked to an LPC, and he was saying that actions don't cause our emotions, it's our own thoughts, because several people can go through the same event and not have the same reaction. So maybe meditation helps you be more aware of your own thoughts, and I think that's something you discussed.
Very much so. Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it.
Like mental health and Buddhism is very on par.
It is when I talk about it, because that's my perspective, that's my bias.
Well, no. I talked to a Christian LPC. He's not a Buddhist at all, and everything he was telling me, and I would tell him, I was like, oh my God, like we just talked about that in temple or whatever.
Well, good. But whenever I see that overlap with other religions, for me, that's a sign that there's an underlying truth there.
Definitely.
And that's awesome. That's always great to hear about.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, this is Jerry.
Oh my gosh.
I know it's been a while, Alex.
It's been a while. Good to hear from you. Go ahead, Jerry.
Together here, so.
It's good to hear from you too, and thank you for doing this this talk about a very important topic and very relevant to what's going on right now, needless to say. For me personally, I've been trying to educate myself more about race and racism. And the thing that I'm running across is, I think, very in line with what you're talking about. And it's this idea that what could otherwise be a teachable moment for people who might exhibit racism in whatever way in life, they're closed off to that teachable moment because of their emotional reaction to being called a racist, to being called out on their racist behaviors. And so the question, I think, and I read this by Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility. She said that the question is not, am I a racist? The question should be, how has white supremacy and racism impacted my life and my views by being born and raised in a racist society? And I think that that's a much more helpful framework for dealing with these very difficult questions. And you're right, I think it is about mindfulness and being open essentially to learning and being better?
Reading those books, watching those videos, watching the news, it offers that contrasting perspective that can help us see that space in between. When there's an incongruence with what we're seeing and what we believe, there's that friction. And so
Yes.
the friction is where we need to try and look. And that's the opportunity for change and for enlightenment and for nirvana.
And Alex, isn't it a lot more, just real quick, isn't it freeing essentially to be able to admit to yourself, gosh, you know, I have this within me and it's okay because we all do. And now I'm ready to do the work to better myself, to get rid of this virus of racism that's within me. It just seems that it's so much more freeing to be able to do that than to live with it and defend it.
Agreed.
No, I think I really like the word, rather than racist, biased. Say I'm biased, because I think that's kind of what you're talking about, the conditioning. We build permanent biases through the conditioning, right? And then biased means we're prone to look in a certain direction, in a certain angle, with a certain mindset. So you're right, Jerry. I think the way to think about it is we all have implicit bias. If you want to call that racism, maybe that's one facet of bias. But I think, a bias is almost like a warping or a constraint on the direction you're moving in your mind. So
I agree that bias seems to be a bigger umbrella term, and racism is one form of bias. I would challenge anyone, and this is not just for you, Leon, I'm not directing this towards you, for everyone, and for everyone that you'll be talking about these issues. It's important that we be mindful. Are we using a different word other than racism because racism makes us feel uncomfortable?
that's a good point.
So it's important, yes, from an intellectual perspective, bias is a much larger term. Buddhism focuses more on bias because it's the bias that causes us suffering. And so, yes, there is an importance to knowing the difference and knowing that Buddhism focuses at this level, at the bias level, and that racism is a subsection. But it's also important for you to ask, are you avoiding the word racist or racism because it makes you feel uncomfortable? And if it does, there's a teachable for you. There's a moment for you to be aware of that friction. What happens a lot of times is it's hard. We have such a negative connotation with racism. Again, conditioned. When we think of our education of what racism was, what we learned in school, we were learning about, Black students being spit on when they went into the schools. We were learning about the negative terms that were being used. We learned about this very extreme, overt racism. And so we've been conditioned to associate that extreme racism with the word racist or racism. And so it's very natural to have, I don't do that. And that's often the very first thing that people say, I'm not a racist. Why? Because I'm not what I was taught in school was racism. But when you look and study about racism more, you see that there's another level to it, a very subtle and sinister level that is not, it's not your fault. It's your fault if you stay with it, but it's not your fault that you have it because you were raised in this environment. You were raised in this condition. You were conditioned this way and you didn't know. But as you become more and more aware of it, you become more and more responsible for doing something about it.
Alex, it's Min. So I think maybe the same thing could apply to sexism. A lot of men will say, I'm not sexist, but if you grow up in a society where leaders are men, then it's hard for them to, maybe admit that, I might have some aspect of sexism.
Agreed. very much so. And I know for me, one of the things I had to become mindful of very early on in my in college and in high school, the idea used to be, oh, you're Latino, you're a minority, so you can't be racist. But as I look back at my the environment and the communities that I lived in, yeah, even though I'm a Puerto Rican, even though we Puerto Ricans love to brag about how Puerto Ricans are of all different colors on the island, the truth is racism does exist within the island and within our culture. And so there's a bias, as Leon says, that goes beyond just the racism we're talking about, and that's why Buddhism focuses at that level, because that's the big. If we can take care of this, everything else is also taken care of. But sometimes it's just easier to focus on these little steps first to get there.
So one thing that I like that Leon said was like that you should sometimes call it just bias, even though we know it's racist. I think like how you were saying, maybe we just need to use bias when we're discussing it with other people. I don't know, so downplaying it might be good sometimes.
Agreed. Because it goes back to the amygdala. The word
I'm going to go the opposite.
Huh?
To tell you, I'm going to go the opposite. I believe that these types of conversations with regards to race are always uncomfortable. They need to remain uncomfortable until it becomes more part of the normality of people's society. Because if you have these uncomfortable situations and you're talking about race and you feel as though, oh, maybe I should just put this in a broader perspective and put this as a bias, that kind of diminishes the idea of what you just did was racist or what you just said was racist. And that needs to be pinpointed, it needs to be specified, and it needs to be called out. And to just say, oh, this person is being biased or something like that, I think diminishes the severity of what racism is. And I don't believe that that should ever happen. And I think that we've been doing that so much in the society that this is why we're in the situation that we're in right now. And I'll mute because I'm sorry, my son is doing guitar lessons, so.
No problem.
I would just like to say that I agree that it sucks that if you like downplay it because that feels unconstructive. But I feel like in a sense, depending on who you're talking to, if for instance you want to say, oh, Donald Trump is racist, all of a sudden every Republican just won't listen to the next word you say. They're just going to say, oh, you're just a liberal quack and I'm not going to listen to what you're going to say. But if you start off by saying, well, I think he's a little biased, and these are the things that I think he's biased for, you might actually get a couple words in for them to actually listen. But I agree with you, though, that it is such a major thing, and it's been so bad for so long. But sometimes you have to, like, just do whatever you can just to get the other side to listen just for a second.
I think it boils down to
The issue with that is I believe that that was done prior
yes.
to his election. I believe that that was already stated. I believe that that was already pointed out. People were screaming at the top of at their lungs, you know, he's not a good person. He does show these particular biases. He wasn't, other than I think black people, because I know we called him out as racist. Other Democrats, for the same fear that you are exhibiting, that the Republicans will shut down and shut off, are what allowed him to get elected in the first place. So this was not something that people did not try already, and we are at that point where we understand this does not work. So we do have to come about this at a different way. Now, I'm not saying that I have the end all be all, but I am saying that I do not tend to have these kinds of uncomfortable conversations with my white friends. One, because I'm a very, very light-skinned black. And a lot of my white people, and what really, 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 really hurts even to this day is, well, you can't possibly be having the same types of racial experiences as your darker counterparts. And what's different is, I think when I was growing up, because, you know, I lived in Chicago, I was one of the few biracial people in Chicago. I was born only 9 years after the case of Loving. So there were no people that looked like me. There really weren't. So white people knew what I was, black people knew what I was, and I got it on I was considered something that was an anomaly, but not in a good way. I was considered something that was, you know, this horrible mixture of races, something that shouldn't exist in the first place. And it didn't matter whether I was a light-skinned person and somehow more acceptable. I was less acceptable because I was a mixture. So when growing up in this society and understanding that that's what I was always considered, it was especially right now, it's crazy for white people to tell me, oh, you must not experience the same things. And so I don't have these conversations, and I become fearful of these conversations, but lately I have become angry with these conversations, which is it doesn't matter what color I was when we tried to tell you something, you all did not listen. And so I think that was the same back in 2016, back in 2015 when he was running. A lot of people said, you know, yeah, he's got some biases, instead of outright saying, nah, he's racist. And this is, again, what we have come to.
I agree. I think we need to just directly address it and call it what it is. But I too am struggling with having these conversations, like with my parents and with family and friends, because when you do address it so directly, sometimes they do shut off, and I just feel stuck, and then I end up getting emotional because I don't know how to get through to them. So, if y'all have any suggestions, I'm open to hearing them.
What I was thinking of as all of you were talking is the teachings of skillful means. I think, in my opinion, I don't know, and it could be a misinformed opinion due to my conditioning. The answer might be both, but it requires wisdom to know when to do one and when to do the other. Right now, I think the right thing is to call it racism and to use that word and to stir up those feelings. One-on-one, I can also see how if I needed to talk to my mother about it, easing into the conversation might be good with using the word bias, but at some point I have to use the word also racism and deal with the discomfort of that conversation. I think Maida has a really good point that we've been trying a nice way for a long time now and it's not working. So skillful means and hoping for the wisdom to know when to use what tool. For me, it's trial and error. I do mess up quite a bit, and I think for me, seeing what I've seen on the TV has made me less scared of making a mistake. I've put my foot in my mouth, and I see it now as an opportunity to learn. I apologize, I listen, I learn, and then I try again. And because I'm no longer afraid of making those mistakes, because I have individuals who are giving me that safe space, I have learned a lot in this last week I did not know about. Helped me a lot. So don't make those mistakes. Now's the time to learn from them. We have gone over by 5 minutes. That's fine. Maida, do you want to say anything to response or anything else you want to close us off with?
I do agree that sometimes I really don't know how to approach this. I've had family members that, you know, where they say subtle things like all lives matter, or where they say things like all police officers aren't bad. You need to. It's very difficult at that point to even start the conversation with them, because I said at this point you all have really missed the whole idea of what this is. You've really missed, I think, the pain and the anger when you say these little things, because you don't understand how hurtful they are when they bring up Martin Luther King about his peaceful protests, but they forget what happened to Martin Luther King and those peaceful protesters. It was the violence and it was the violence that happened to them that I think everybody forgets, that actually changed opinions, that embarrassed this country into changing its ways. It wasn't that they were marching down the street. I mean, the bus, let's see, the bus boycott was 382 days. 382 days that people were boycotting. It didn't happen overnight. Let's say that there was some other, several months, years that they were doing these things and having these horrific things happen to them. And it took these kinds of images that the world was seeing to change tides. So I think that I don't know how to best explain the situation and the race and all of these things to people at this point, because I don't know how to get rid of those small little conditions that everybody has now kind of, I guess, been acclimated to. Yeah, so I think that's the best I can do.
I'm so glad you're in the conversation, Mita. I appreciate you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it too.
Great. All of you, stay humble. We don't have the answer. No one has the answer. We're stumbling as we humans tend to do. What I have found for me personally is if I do more listening than talking, I learn a lot more. And so, Mita, thank you very much. I think everything you said needed to be heard, and I know I can speak for myself that I heard it, and I think by the nodding heads that I saw here, a lot of us heard it too. So just keep listening, everyone, and keep learning, keep being mindful. And when you find the answer, let everyone else know, please.
No, I'm going to keep it to myself.
Take care, everyone. Be safe, be healthy.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
I really enjoyed it.
Next week, another Zoom meeting?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. See you all then. Take care.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good night.
Bye. Thanks.